Thanks for dropping in this week. I'll start this one up top this week as I welcome you to our show for March 24th, 2021. Don't be shy. Take this time to become part of the community for the show by signing up at YouTube, as well as subscribing to my newsletter at Substack. Just look for Working Life and you will find it all. And that helps us build a community, and you can help us spread the word. And of course, if you'd like to become a financial sponsor of the show, and especially if you've been part of the audience for a long time and been getting the benefit of a ton of information here, go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there, and you will see a link to Patreon, where you can sign up today, as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter of our network. Or you can do the same thing by using ActBlue. Go over to ActBlue, look for Working Life with Jonathan Tasini, and there you can become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. Please do that this week. Help us keep this show going. Support us in what we're trying to do. I can't just ignore the patently insane behavior underway in the country. There's so many categories of that. Thankfully, as of last week, I am fully vaccinated. A little muscle achiness, a little fatigue, but it was pretty mild all in all. But until this pandemic is really over, I'm going to keep wearing a mask in public places. Not really as much for my safety as for the safety of others. I've actually been double masking everywhere for a long time, except when I cycle or hike, when I wear just one mask. And I'm going to still mask because we still don't know for sure whether vaccination stops someone from getting sick, but still allows that nasty little fucker to lurk around and get passed on to others. This whole past year has been a really sad display of selfishness and stupidity encouraged by low-life politicians who skimped on relief to people. And I'm partly thinking today of Rand Paul, who should have his medical license revoked for encouraging people not to wear masks. He's a complete and utter piece of shit. Am I right? But I also mean almost the entire political class that bungled the response by refusing to shut down the entire country for a month and pay people full wages for the entire time to stay home. The fact is, the pandemic could have been over in a month if everyone had been paid to stay home and everyone had worn a mask for just 4 weeks. Just look at the low incidence, almost non-existent number of flu cases during the pandemic because people were wearing masks and staying home. But nope, somehow it was too big a burden not to go to a bar. Please spare me the rhetoric about community if you also went walking maskless into big gatherings. You know, we have a real reckoning to do in this country on so many levels, and some real responsibility towards other people is at the top of my list. Now that I've got that off my chest and I've been vaccinated, so that's what I was thinking of. And speaking of caring about others, tomorrow a high-level group will convene, virtually naturally, to talk about creating an international social fund to assist the people of lower-income countries come out of the year-long pandemic economic shutdown. Now, folks in the audience who lap up every one of our episodes with gusto will know that I spent a lot of time on the crisis facing workers around the world who, before the pandemic even hit, faced some pretty dire economic realities. Just recently, you may remember, I had a follow-up segment about a move to create $2 trillion of so-called special drawing rights at the International Monetary Fund, money that would be effectively grants to low-income countries at no cost to U.S. taxpayers and without adding more debt burden to the borrowing countries. A no-brainer, right? So what's the idea now for a social fund? Let's get the answer from our good friend Cathy Feingold, director of the AFL-CIO's International Affairs Department and deputy president of the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents 200 million unionized workers all across the globe. Now, this panel, Cathy, that you are part of and organizing, that's in conjunction with the spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, is about something that you're trying to put together, which is establishing a global social protection fund. And I want to talk about some of the specifics about that. But one of the things that really caught my eye, and it's not about low-income countries, it's actually about the United States. In the summary for this panel, and I'm going to just read from it, you say there is limited capacity for low-income countries to respond to the social and economic consequences of COVID-19 because of underdeveloped social protection systems and limited revenue. And the first thing that came to my mind is, well, the U.S. may have a lot of revenue, but my God, we have such an underdeveloped social protection system here that really everybody saw during the pandemic, with people not having sick leave, bad safety and health situation in many of the frontline workers. I don't want to talk about the United States too much in our conversation, but that struck me.
Oh, of course. And I just want for everyone to know, social protection is a term that's used more commonly in other countries. We often say social security nets in our country, and it's really the same thing. It's really creating a floor that protects working people. And I think you're right. And so I'd like to clarify, what we're talking about is the creation of a global social protection fund for some of the poorest countries. But what we're also doing is building a coalition in the US, which is really to increase funding around global social protection for development assistance, but also highlight the failures of our own system and systems around the world that have left 60% of working people do not have social protection programs. 60%.
That's not surprising, unfortunately. It's sad and just amoral. And just to make one more point about the United States, optimistically, I have thought in this whole year that we've been immersed in this pandemic that there is this opening now to talk to a lot more people, both from the standpoint of the labor movement and other folks, talk to a lot of people about the fact that we have this awful system in the country where you had people who couldn't go home and get well because there was no paid sick leave. You know the whole list. So I wonder if you're optimistic about the ability to have that conversation as well.
I think so. I think also, some of the conversation people are currently having around the equity issues, around the vaccines, we should also be talking about social protection. If you do not have paid leave, it's very difficult to go far away to a mass vaccination site. And so without social protection programs, you do not have the needed tools to really respond, not only to this current crisis, but another crisis I know you're focused on, which is the climate crisis. You cannot transition workers out of industries with heavy fossil fuel if there's no social protection systems that will give them income support, pension bridges, healthcare in the need to transition workers. So social protection must be part of the way we rebuild and transform the global economy.
That's a brilliant point, especially in connecting it, as you just did, to climate change. Okay, so how would this global social protection fund work? How would it be funded, and how would the money be distributed? Have people thought this through already, the mechanics of it?
Absolutely. So remember, many of the countries, the poorest countries in the world, many countries where our US brands, multinational companies, source and produce products, have no social protection systems. And that has had a real impact on supply chains. So what we've been looking at is the International Labor Organization estimates that around $78 billion annually would be needed to fund a social protection floor for the world's poorest, lowest income countries. Now, that sounds like a big number, but if you think about it, it would impact about 28 countries. And 78 billion to rebuild with resilience means you're then not spending an emergency money, like the current moment we're in, to patch up the needs of people during a crisis so that you're building resilience.
When you said that number, I actually thought it was so low. When you said 78 billion, I thought we're talking about tens of millions of people. I would have thought that it should be a factor of 5 or 10-fold more. So actually, that seems like a very small number.
Yeah, and I mean, so what we're doing, this is being advocated in what's called the Group of 20, which is some of the 20 largest industrialized countries. It's a forum where leaders go to sort of coordinate responses, especially now to the pandemic. We're asking that the international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank help step up and figure out how we get financing for these critical issues. We are also really excited. I'll be on this panel with Olivier de Schutter, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And he's helping to kind of build out the framework for this global fund because he knows you can't address poverty without addressing social protection.
So would this fund be built by the G20, by, if I can use the term, the rich countries? And then if you're a low income country, you would come to this fund and say, we need X money. I'm being very, superficial about it.
So it's the political will that we need to first have really leaders, and we have a lot of countries now agreeing to lead, and the Biden administration we think is going to be able to lead on this important issue. The actual financing, and the International Trade Union Confederation, we're going to release a report at this webinar next week around how you finance it. It's not just from the countries itself. Some of it could come from there, but it's also these international financial multilateral banks that we're asking for them to refocus some of their funding to address these needs.
Now, you mentioned that this meeting is taking place in conjunction with the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. And I've done a couple of segments on the program about this attempt to create the special drawing rights, which you are quite familiar with. And I'm wondering how that would dovetail with this fund, because at least the effort to create the special drawing rights, to remind my audience, this would be money essentially that would be created by the IMF so that poor countries could come and essentially have an account, a line item, where they could draw on that money in order to buy, let's say, vaccines or support their people, get people back to work. I wonder how those things parallel or dovetail.
Absolutely. So this week we had a meeting with Secretary Yellen. I joined a meeting with faith leaders and Jubilee USA, and this was on the agenda. So you need two major things in addition to the Global Social Protection Fund. You need debt relief. Countries should not be servicing their debt when they should be investing in vaccines and healthcare and safe workplaces right now. The second is something called a special drawing right, which is an international monetary fund. And just so people understand, this actually doesn't cost us anything.
Zero.
It's a
That's
really
right.
easy thing that Secretary Yellen can do. And so she has said publicly right now that at least we can get about $500 billion made available through this system called the special drawing rights. It gets very in the weeds, but the most important thing is it frees up money, gives country the space they need to spend on the key social protection programs that are needed during this crisis.
And just to underscore, because this topic has fascinated me for many weeks, and I've had Mark Weisbrot, one of your colleagues, on the show to talk about this a couple of times. Your point is, doesn't cost the U.S. taxpayer a single dime, and as important for the low-income countries, it's essentially a grant. They're not adding to their debt burden through these special drawing rights. So that would be a huge deal for them to get this money that isn't then essentially burdening them further into the future.
Absolutely. And that's what we are really pushing for, extending debt relief. We do not need to have this model of, poor countries constantly indebted to richer countries so that they can never build out their social protection system. So I feel hopeful. I think we're at a moment, you started by asking me, can this get done? I think this is the first time I have seen business leaders understand their supply chains can't function if they don't have workers who have paid sick leave or can have income support when the consumer demand goes down, right? This is a win-win for governments, for workers, and for business. We've got to get it done.
Well, you were telepathic, actually, as we round up our conversation. Back in the special drawing rights, one of the things that was interesting to me that when this campaign started, Goldman Sachs supported it. You had all these big corporations supporting it because if you're amoral and you don't care about people and you don't care that people die, just from a business standpoint, you can't actually reopen the global economy if the vaccines aren't there, if the pandemic isn't brought under control, but more important, if people can't survive and make a decent living. Unfortunately, 2/3 of the economy here is based on consumer spending. That's true in many other parts of the world. So you really actually have to have demand. And the only way to do that is to give people money.
Absolutely. And I would just say, for people that feel perhaps they're really removed from this conversation, I would say for folks listening here in the United States or in other countries that, we invite people to join us. One way that we're grounding this back in the United States is we believe that the U.S. Agency for International Development, some of our State Department funding should get repurposed. We should create a global fund. We're going to ask, hopefully, Samantha Powers, when she gets into office as a head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, let's build out as a global social protection fund. What a great use of our taxpayer dollars is to support an initiative that really would put a needed floor under working people during the pandemic and as we rebuild.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you very much for being on the program. Thank you very much for all the work that you and the AFL-CIO have been doing on this. Good luck with the panel, and we'll keep on this story as it unfolds.
Great. Thanks so much.
For 20 years, Rick Larsen has been a useless member of Congress, theoretically representing the 2nd Congressional District in the state of Washington. By useless, I mean in the sense that you can't find a single initiative that he took the lead on and worked hard to pass in his entire 20 years in Congress. His best claim to fame might be that there isn't a corporate dollar he hasn't been willing to pocket, from defense contractors to healthcare companies to big tech companies like Amazon and Google to planet polluters like big oil companies. He is Mr. Corporate PAC Money. So he's not just useless, actually, to regular people. He's a downright cancer, shilling repeatedly for big money and big corporations. Jason Call is taking on Larsen in the Democratic primary for the seat in 2022. A longtime activist, Jason casts his campaign in this light, as he says on his website, callforcongress.com, and I'm quoting now, "Good government is possible when we rein in the undue influence of giant corporations and directly challenge their power. Together, I believe we can prevent them from continuing to write laws that massively benefit the wealthy to the detriment of everyone else." End quote. That sounds pretty good, huh? And Jason joins me now to talk more about his campaign. I have to say that right off the bat, Jason, I'm impressed with your setup there. You look like a professional podcaster or radio guy.
Thank you. In the Zoom age, and especially as a candidate now, you get offered enough opportunity to do this that it's really worth the investment to get a pro setup. So yeah, here we are.
So you're running for Congress. What got into you that made you decide to give up probably a great life? You're a husband, you're a father, you're a musician, you do lots of interesting things. Why did you decide to go this crazy route of running for office?
It is a little bit crazy, yes. Well, I mean, I have a history of as an activist. I've been an anti-war activist 30 years. I protested as a freshman, sophomore at the University of Washington, protested the first Iraq war with Desert Storm. And I think once you get that activist bug and you are become aware of injustices coming from being a sheltered child, and you get out into the world, as I did in college, and you realize how much injustice there is in the world, and you get that bug and you want to fight back, and it never leaves you. But so, I've done activism for a long time, didn't really get into the political side of it until I was inspired by Howard Dean back in 2003. And so started to get into electoral politics more around then, supportive of Dennis Kucinich and, certainly Bernie Sanders. I think it was really the Bernie Sanders bug. I see the book behind you, but, Bernie has inspired so many people, but, he kind of put it on us as activists to go be that change. And I've been oppositional to the congressman here in Washington, who is a Democrat, very conservative Democrat. I've been oppositional to him since He signed on to the Bankruptcy Act in 2005, and I people have challenged him from the left in the past and have not really done a great job of it because he's got a lot of establishment institutional support. And it really came down to having that inspiration to say, and other people getting behind me and saying, you're the right person to do this. I don't know that I would have chosen to do it myself, but other people pushed me into it. And so here we are, we're taking on the fight for justice.
And we'll get to your opponent in a moment. You did mention the Bankruptcy Act, and I just want to remind my audience that Joe Biden was one of the main sponsors of the Bankruptcy Act as a promoter and, if I can say, a shill for the credit card industry back in the days when he was the United States Senator. I don't want to go down that path. I don't want to go down that path right now. Just because it's a distraction. I want to focus on you.
Sure.
You have a completely progressive agenda, and there are 2 or 3 points I want to pull out from your agenda to focus on because you have a particularly unique take on them that I haven't necessarily found with other candidates. The first thing that I saw, which I compliment you for, is a lot of people have been talking about raising the federal minimum wage, and they've talked about raising it to $15 an hour. And that's been a great hue and cry and a great campaign. And obviously that's a whole lot better than the pathetic $7.25 an hour that folks are getting now. But as I've pointed out in this program repeatedly, that even at $15 an hour, if you work 52 weeks a year, 40 hours a week, you would still, if you were a family of 4, just be above the poverty level, just barely. And so you actually call for, to start from, you call for a $20 an hour minimum wage. And you're totally right about this. It should be much higher. Give me your thinking behind that.
Well, I think anybody who works, I mean, it deserves a living wage, and I don't even want to say anybody who works because I'm supportive of UBI. Also, I think everybody deserves a living income. I think about my disabled friends who are unable to work, and they deserve dignity in living also. But you know, $20 an hour is not even enough. I think last year when we ran, we certainly looked at 15 and said 15 is insufficient. Yes, it would be nice to have. $20 is sort of that $5 incremental, but realistically, we should be making somewhere around $25 to $27 an hour. If we go back to wages, and I'm not sure where the index is, I want to say it's around 1968. But if we index things from there, you know, where we are right now is that the working class has lost ground in their income by comparison. So I want to make sure that anybody who goes out and puts the time into a job is going to get fairly compensated for it with a living wage. And you can't live anywhere in this country reasonably. You certainly can't raise a family. If we want to talk about family values, income has to be part of that equation.
So, yes, you're correct that if you look at productivity going back about 4 decades, the minimum wage should be around $22, $23 an hour at least, just to start from. And essentially, workers have been robbed of the sweat of the brow for that long by many companies, not just those in the fast food industry. Now, you mentioned universal basic income, which was, in fact, something else I wanted to raise. Now, that's a little bit controversial. And what I mean by controversial, even in progressive circles, it's a little bit controversial. Andrew Yang has adopted it. I'm not necessarily considering him a progressive. He's kind of a libertarian from my point of view, though a very smart guy. I like listening to him because you can tell, unlike 99% of the politicians, that there's something going on upstairs, which is refreshing. So give me your, if I can say, elevator speech on universal basic income, and specifically how much would it be? Because you don't cite a specific figure in your proposal.
You know what? I don't know that I can put my number on a figure. I mean, that would be something for us to sit down around a table and talk about what is a reasonable amount. But what I would say about it is, one of the things that I would caution about UBI, first of all, I think everybody deserves a basic income level. What I would not want to see happen, and this goes to a lot of other policies, is that we see increases in the price of rent. I don't want UBI to become essentially a direct transfer of payment to landlords. So we need to have things like rent control. We need to make sure that we are controlling costs on healthcare. So UBI, in conjunction with Medicare for all, a federal jobs guarantee. That I think it's part of the whole package.
And that's the point, actually, that lots of folks, and I consider myself in that group, skeptical of UBI, are concerned that it wouldn't just be a transfer to landlords. It would be a reasoning for the deficit hawks and those folks who cry about government spending to say, well, we're giving people UBI now so we can cut over here, say, unemployment insurance.
Exactly. We can't let the capitalists control the messaging around UBI. And really, I consider myself an MMT adherent. Also, I've done a number of podcasts with some MMT economists, modern monetary theory. And I fully believe that we have the entire picture of economics backwards. Being that the federal government is the sole issuer of our currency. So I would encourage your listeners, if they are not aware of MMT, to really look into that as a way to fight back against these deficit hawks, because really, as Stephanie Kelton said, the deficit is a myth. Our government, the capitalists in our government, choose to spend money on war whenever they want to. They are fine with tax cuts for the rich, knowing very well that just is a way to increase income inequality, so that the top 1% has more power. It's really about power. So, it's one of the things about progressive policies that you really have to address them all kind of at the same time. It's like a big package of things.
Mm-hmm. And last in your policy proposals, you have something interesting. I haven't seen this from other progressive candidates. You want to create a national solidarity fund funded by a 1 cent per worker hour tax, paying stipends to workers who are striking or locked out. What's your idea behind that?
I think there's a lot of reticence, and I was as a teacher for almost 20 years. I was a union worker. I was a union activist, a building rep. I was on the board of my local for a number of years. I was a rep to our state assembly for a number of years. And when we talk about strike actions and the need for strike actions, there is always the economic impact on the striking workers themselves. And what are we going to do about that? Now, I happen to believe the right to strike is a fundamental workers' right. But if people are going to be impacted economically, then they're going to be reticent to do that. And so that's really the impetus by saying, just as a support of labor rights and workers' rights, that there should be some assistance when workers are essentially being abused by management in terms of, whatever it is, working conditions or salary or whatever. To have that fund there would be really the reason, to give workers that freedom.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's turn just briefly to your opponent, who is one of the worst conservative Democrats, corporate-funded Democrats in the House, Rick Larsen. And you put together a very interesting table, very interesting website sheet that has all of his contributions and the folks who are financing him, the tech overlords, the fossil fuel guzzlers, the war machine, the climate criminals. I know you like these subtle headlines. Give us the big picture of who Rick Larsen is. And as important, do you think that the folks who have been voting for him understand where his money's coming from and understand that money is undermining their own standard of living?
So Rick came from a lobbying background. He was a Washington State Dental Association lobbyist here in Washington. And if you know anything about our politics here in Washington, the dental lobby is actually one of the most powerful lobbies in the state. They are definitely in the ears of our state legislators. He was funded for the county that I live in, Snohomish County in Washington. He was funded by the lobbying industry to get a county council seat. He did half a term on that seat before the lobbying industry again elevated him to an open seat in Congress for District 2. Since then, he has gotten 75% of his funding from corporate sources. As you mentioned on my website, Rick's Receipts, we've got it all broken down. 51% of that, if I have the number correct, comes directly from corporate PACs. The other, 24, 25% to get you up to the 75% comes from individuals who have maxed out, but they are, when you look at their titles, they are CEOs, they are managers, they are executives. And you go back and you look, and there are people from the dental industry, people from the fossil fuel industry, people from the banking industry. Less than 5% of his donors are what you would consider small donors, giving less than $200 to his campaign in a cycle. So, he is truly in the pockets of the corporations, in particular the fossil fuel industry, the defense industry, and the banking industry. So, do I really think, and he votes that way. I mean, he has voted to deregulate Dodd-Frank. He has voted to repeal the estate tax. He has voted, as you saw, for the bankruptcy bill. These are classic Larsen votes. So I want to say a little bit more about him in terms of his effectiveness as a legislator. Of all of the Democrats who got elected in 2000, he has the least amount of floor speaking time of all of them who are still there. He hasn't gotten a bill through committee since 2000, a bill signed into legislation since 2013. He hangs his environmental hat on a 2008 piece of legislation that was wilderness preservation here in Washington, and yet he's trying to rebrand himself as a grassroots environmentalist. He got nothing out of committee he's very in the last.
Yeah, his fingerprints are not to be seen in Congress. So let me now transfer the conversation a little bit to the voters then.
Exactly.
Because you have to obviously take that away from the inner circle of those people who pay attention to someone who, in fact, has very light fingerprints and very low visibility. How do you convince voters to basically throw an incumbent like that out of office?
It's a challenge because, but I want to say in this district is doable. First of all, we have a pretty environmentally active district. I mean, we have people in our district who are very concerned about pollution, about rising tides. Here in this district, we got a lot of coastline. We're going to be impacted in the future by global warming more than many in the country. So what we do is I am involved in the local Democratic Party. I have been for a number of years. Last year, we got 7 endorsements out of the 14 local Democratic parties here. We're going to go through the endorsement processes. It's always an opportunity to talk to the people. I happen to be the parliamentarian of my local legislative district, Democrats. And so, I'm a known quantity. And what I've heard back, and the other thing I wanted to say is Washington State is a top 2 primary. So what we have to do is to get voters to recognize that we're not even necessarily trying to take Larsen off of the top post with this effort. We want to be on the ballot next to him and to tell them, look at the way he messaged in the last cycle. It was all anti-Trump. He completely ignored any policy positions. If you put us on the ballot next to him, he has to address policy issues, which he has never had to do before. And I think that is one of the key points of our messaging to voters in the district is, do you want to have policy conversations, or are you willing to take the lowest bar that is possible for a Democrat? We are a D+10 district. This is a solidly blue district that is in no danger of going into Republican hands. And so the best case scenario for voters in this district is to have 2 Democrats going against each other, one corporate, one foot in, one foot out with the Democratic Party to the left. I mean, I'll be honest about it.
Yeah. So
have those policy conversations.
So to wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you a personal question about what it's like to be a candidate. What are the things that have been frankly challenging, and be honest about that? I'm sure number one is fundraising. But what's it been like as a candidate? And if you can say something about what it's like to be a candidate, especially in this time during the pandemic, what's been different?
We were really hampered by COVID last year. The presidential primary in Washington was March 10th. COVID essentially shut us down on March 15th. We had put a lot of effort. My campaign team, we're all sort of DSA Bernie types. We really wanted to help Bernie get a win here in Washington State. So we put a lot of our focus into Bernie's campaign rather than our own campaign. And then at the point where we were about to hit the streets for our own field plan, we got locked down. So we were definitely impacted by that. it's important to have funding, but it's also important to have great tech people, and I do have great tech people on my team. I have, obviously, you've seen, I've got great research people, and so I've got a really good team to deal with the challenges presented by COVID. The fact that we can't, but we are going to get out into the streets. I went to West Virginia to help with Paula Jean's campaign. I went to Delaware to help with Jessica Rain's campaign. We did on the ground door knocking there. You can do it safely. You can do it socially distanced. And it's still the best way to have those personal conversations with people about the candidate and about policies. We do plan to do that in district this year. We're not going to, keep everything online.
And optimistically, assuming things go as they are going now with vaccinations, and if we can keep the variants under control, and if we can shut Rand Paul up so he stops promoting the idea that you can run around without a mask, potentially by the fall, you'll be able to campaign a little bit more loosely out in the streets, actually go back to the retail politics of engaging people out there in the community. Thanks for being with us on the show, and we'll keep up with you as your campaign progresses. Good luck.
Appreciate it so much, Jonathan. Thank you.
That'll do it for this week's broadcast. Thanks to my guests, Cathy Feingold and Jason Call. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Of course, consider being a sponsor. Come on, folks, you can do it. Do it whatever level you can afford. Go over to Working Life, look for the podcast tab, and click over there, and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter. Or you can go over to Act Blue and look for Working Life with Jonathan Tasini, and there you can also become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. Just think of this, folks. If hundreds of you do that, like today, I might be able to stop asking you to do this, and wouldn't that be a great thing? Thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.